At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, a routine safety test at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant went wrong in a way that the engineers running it did not understand until the building around them was already gone. The explosion that followed was not a nuclear bomb. It was a steam explosion and a subsequent chemical blast that tore through the reactor core, blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off its housing, and sent a plume of radioactive material, 23 different radionuclides, burning nuclear fuel, graphite from the reactor core, into the atmosphere above northern Ukraine. The fire burned for 10 days. Helicopters dumped thousands of tons of sand, clay, and lead onto the open reactor in a desperate attempt to smother it. 31 people died immediately. 600,000 liquidators, soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners, and medics were mobilized from across the Soviet Union over the following 4 years to contain and clean up the disaster. Nearly 4 million people in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine were exposed to radiation. PBS Today is the 40th anniversary of that morning, and today, the structure that was built at a cost of $3 billion to contain what that morning left behind, the largest movable object ever constructed by human beings, a steel arch the height of a 30-story building built by 45 nations and slid into place over the ruins of the reactor on rails in 2016, is no longer able to perform its key safety functions. Not because it aged, not because the engineering failed. Because on February 14th, 2025, Valentine's Day, a Russian Guran 2 attack drone struck its upper section and punched through both its outer and inner cladding. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi said after a comprehensive safety assessment, "The protective shield has lost confinement capability. Limited temporary repairs have been carried out on the roof, but timely and comprehensive. Restoration remains essential to prevent further degradation and ensure long-term nuclear safety. Is the public lost confinement capability?" That is the language of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is not an organization that uses alarming words carelessly. What those 3 words mean in practice is this. Inside the damaged structure, beneath the compromised arch, behind the makeshift repairs that are currently the only thing holding the situation stable, sits the original Soviet sarcophagus, hastily built in 206 days in 1986 by workers who could not stay in one place long enough to weld properly because the radiation would kill them if they did. And inside that sarcophagus, which was never designed to last, which was only ever intended to buy time, sits approximately 200 tons of molten nuclear fuel, radioactive dust, and unstable debris that has been sitting there for 40 years. Greenpeace's senior nuclear specialist Sean Burney said, "That would be catastrophic because there's 4 tons of dust, highly radioactive dust, fuel pellets, enormous amounts of radioactivity inside the sarcophagus. Asia times here is the detail that tells the real story. The new Safe Confinement was not built merely to keep rain off the ruins. It was built with a specific engineering purpose that cannot be accomplished with a damaged structure. Inside the arch, gantry cranes and robotic systems were installed to begin the controlled dismantlement of the original sarcophagus and the safe removal of the 200 tons of nuclear material inside it." Engineer Eric Schmeeman, who worked on the design and construction of the new Safe Confinement, stated that the damage prevents the safe dismantling of the sarcophagus using the facility's internal cranes and robotic systems. Grist. The plan had been to begin that dismantlement phase this year, 2026, on the 40th anniversary. Ukrainian specialists overseeing the cleanup had aimed to start that dismantlement stage this year, but the drone attack has made that impossible. According to those Bologna has spoken to, none of that work can move forward until a full repair process has been completed, which is not expected until 2030. RNZ'd 4 more years of waiting, 4 more years of makeshift patches, holding a structure that was designed to be the permanent solution, on top of a temporary structure that was designed to last only long enough for the permanent solution to be built, around a reactor core that has been sitting open to gradual deterioration since the night of April 26, 1986. The French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot estimated after a G7 foreign ministers meeting that the dome required almost 500 million euros in repairs. Asia Times. That money has not been fully committed. The war that caused the damage is still being fought. The airspace above the exclusion zone is regularly crossed by Russian drones on their way to Kyiv, 80 miles to the south, and the site whose security depends on that airspace remaining clear has no meaningful ability to guarantee it. To understand what is actually at stake inside that damaged arch, you have to understand what was left behind inside the reactor on the morning of April 27, 1986, and what 40 hours, years of radioactive decay has done and not done to it. When reactor number 4 exploded, the core did not simply empty. The explosion blew out some of the material and dispersed it across the site and into the atmosphere. But the majority of the nuclear fuel, The uranium dioxide, the graphite moderator, the cladding, the structural elements of the reactor itself, melted in the heat of the subsequent fire and flowed downward through the floors of the reactor building, mixing with sand, concrete, and other materials as it went. This mixture cooled and solidified in the basement levels of the building into formations that scientists named lava-like fuel-containing materials, or more colloquially, corium. The most famous of these formations is called the Elephant's Foot, a mass of solidified nuclear material in the basement of the building that, in 1986, was so intensely radioactive that a human being standing near it for 300 seconds would receive a lethal dose. A photograph taken of it in 1986 required a remotely operated camera because the radiation was destroying the film too quickly for a person to operate it. 40 years later, the Elephant's Foot is still there. It is less intensely radioactive than it was in 1986 because radioactive decay has reduced the activity of the shorter-lived isotopes. But it still contains long-lived radionuclides, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium isotopes, with half-lives measured in decades and centuries. For long-term contamination, particularly in affected agricultural areas, and the exclusion of zoned, cesium, plutonium, and other long-lived isotopes remain the primary concern. CP24, the material that is still inside the sarcophagus, inside the damaged arch in the basement of reactor number 4, will remain dangerous on human timescales for generations. Now widen the lens, because the drone strike and the delayed dismantlement are the 2026 crisis. The 40-year legacy is a separate and parallel story, and it is one that has never been fully resolved. Not in the science, not in the politics, and not in the lives of the people who carry it in their bodies. Thousands of liquidators died between 1986 and 1989, mostly from heart attacks. They were men in their 20s and 30s. RNZ. The official Soviet death toll released in 1986 was 31. The IAEA's 2005 assessment, conducted by a joint United Nations forum, projected up to 4,000 additional deaths from radiation-related cancer among the most heavily exposed populations. That number has been disputed for decades by Ukrainian and Belarusian doctors who have spent their careers treating former liquidators and exposed populations. By 2019, the Ukrainian government was providing survivors' benefits to 35,000 families, owing to the loss of a breadwinner whose death was deemed possibly related to the Chernobyl accident. Some Ukrainian and Belarusian physicians were calling for the IAEA's estimated toll to be revised upwards, claiming their own data indicates a former liquidator death rate of several thousand per year as a result of diseases related to the disaster. CBS News, several thousand per year, not in 1986, now. In 2026, former liquidators who were young men when they went into the exclusion zone, who were told at the time that the exposure they were receiving was within acceptable limits, who were not tracked systematically in the years and decades that followed, are still dying from cancers and cardiovascular diseases that their treating physicians attribute to that exposure. The number is contested, the mechanism is debated, but the families receiving the benefits are real. The 35,000 breadwinners in Ukraine alone whose deaths were deemed possibly related are real. And the systematic tracking that would resolve the debate, the comprehensive longitudinal study that would definitively establish how many people the disaster has killed over 40 years, was never fully conducted because it required Soviet cooperation at a time when the Soviet Union was more interested in minimizing the disaster than measuring it, and because it would require continued funding and coordination across multiple countries in subsequent decades when the political will for it was inconsistent. One man understood this better than almost anyone. Valery Legasov was a Soviet chemist who led the team that presented the official Soviet explanation of the accident to the IAEA in Vienna in August 1986. In that presentation, he blamed the accident entirely on human error, concealing more than 30 known design flaws in the RBMK reactor. He did it because he was ordered to. On the eve of the accident's second anniversary, Legasov committed suicide. He was demoralized by the authorities' failure to heed his warnings about the safety of the reactor. He was likely also suffering from radiation sickness. RNZ. Before he died, he recorded his account of what actually happened and left the tapes where they would be found. Those recordings became the factual foundation of much of what the world eventually understood about Chernobyl, delivered posthumously by a man who was dying from the disaster he helped contain while his government was lying about the disaster he was dying from. Alexei Harbuz, 72, a medical officer and dentist who treated patients from May to September 1986 while his unit worked on decontamination, returned to Chernobyl this week for the first time in decades. He said, "Being back here, my first feeling is one of immense gratitude for the sacrifice made by my comrades." Fima Anatoly Krutik, 63, deployed in summer 1986 as part of an army battalion to fence off contaminated territory, said no one really thought about it. We didn't know what it was, this invisible enemy. My comrades saw it simply as their duty after being mobilized. FEMA, the invisible enemy. That phrase carries a specific accuracy. Radiation cannot be seen or smelled or felt until it has already done its damage. The liquidators who went into the exclusion zone in the summer of 1986 to build fences, dig trenches, decontaminate equipment, and entomb the reactor were not told, in many cases, the true level of exposure they were receiving. Dosimeters were in short supply. Some were deliberately calibrated to read below the threshold that would have required a worker to be removed from the site. The men who received doses that should have triggered evacuation stayed because the instruments told them they were within limits, and the instruments were wrong. And the people responsible for the instruments knew they were wrong and said nothing. Alexei Lebedinets, 65, who served in the military from 1986 to 1991, building fences in contaminated areas, suffered from headaches for the rest of his life. Returning now, he stopped at Pripyat, the nearby city for Chernobyl's workers, which has been abandoned since the accident. He said, "It's heartbreaking to see Pripyat now. I remember those houses when they were full of life, and now everything is overgrown and in ruins. It was such a beautiful city." FEMA Pripyat. Built in 1970 for the workers of the Chernobyl plant, it was home to 48,000 people on the morning of April 26, 1986. The city of Pripyat, 3 kilometers to the north, where 55,000 workers lived, was evacuated 40 hours after the accident. RNZ 40 hours. The families who lived there on that morning were told they were leaving temporarily. They were told to take only what they could carry for 3 days. They were told they would return. They never did. The apartments where they left dishes in the drying rack and toys on the bedroom floor. And calendars open to April 1986 have been abandoned for 40 years. The city that was once closed to outsiders because it was a Soviet nuclear facility is now closed to outsiders because the exclusion zone was sealed after Russia's 2022 invasion. Pripyat has not been accessible to the tourist industry that had developed around it since 2022. The exclusion zone remains. The land within it, across roughly 2,600 square kilometers of northern Ukraine and neighboring Belarus, remains contaminated at levels that preclude normal habitation. Nature has reclaimed it. Wolves, lynx, bears, and endangered Przewalski's horses move through what was farmland and residential areas. The absence of humans has created an accidental wildlife reserve in a zone where the soil still holds cesium and strontium and plutonium from 1986. Scientists studying the exclusion zone's wildlife have documented radiation-induced mutations in some species and unexpected resilience in others. The ecological data from Chernobyl has become some of the most studied and most debated in environmental science because it represents a 40-year uncontrolled experiment in what happens when a landscape becomes radioactive and humans leave. Back inside the damaged arch, the situation as of today, the 40th anniversary, is this. Makeshift repairs are keeping radioactive dust inside the shelter. Almost miraculously, no radiation spikes have been recorded since the initial drone attack in February 2025. RNZ. The IAEA is monitoring. Ukrainian workers are on site. The structure is compromised, but holding. The 200 tons of nuclear material inside is not going anywhere in the immediate term, but the system that was designed to safely remove that material, the cranes, the robots, the controlled dismantlement process that the $380 billion arch was specifically built to enable, cannot operate until the arch is repaired. And the arch cannot be repaired until the war ends, or until the 500 million euros required for repairs is committed, or until the airspace above the exclusion zone can be secured enough to allow the kind of sustained engineering work that repair of the world's largest movable structure requires. None of those conditions currently exist. The repair timeline, according to the engineers who know the structure best, extends to 2030. In the meantime, the original Soviet sarcophagus, built in 206 days by workers dying of radiation exposure, designed to last only long enough for a permanent solution to be found, already significantly deteriorated by the time the new arch was built over it in 2016, continues to degrade inside the compromised structure. The current deadline to dismantle the sarcophagus is October 31st, 2029. St. Thomas source. That deadline was set before the drone strike. Whether it remains achievable is a question that no one is currently in a position to answer with confidence. 40 years ago today, at 1:23 in the morning, the operators of reactor number 4 initiated a test they did not finish. The consequences of those 7 seconds have been managed, contained, monitored, and studied for 4 decades by engineers, scientists, governments, and international organizations at a total cost that runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. They have been carried in the bodies of 600,000 liquidators, in the thyroids of children who drank contaminated milk in Belarus in 1986, in the apartments of Pripyat, where the calendar still reads April, in the soil of the exclusion zone where cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years and will be measurable for centuries. The disaster was not over when the fire went out. It was not over when the sarcophagus was sealed. It was not over when the new arch was slid into place in 2016. 40 years after the explosion that sent radioactive fallout across much of Europe, Chernobyl was meant to stand as a warning from history. Instead, it has become a renewed security threat that extends well beyond the borders of Ukraine. Post-Guam, the arch is damaged. The repair funds are not fully committed. The dismantlement is delayed until 2030. The war continues. The drones keep flying, and inside the ruins of reactor number 4, 200 tons of nuclear material that has been sitting in the dark for 40 years is still waiting for the process that was supposed to safely remove it, a process that cannot begin until the structure built to enable it is made whole again. Oleksiy Harbuz came back this week. He is 72 years old. He laid flowers at the monument. He said the independence of Ukraine was born on April 26, 1986. He said without the heroism of his comrades, an independent Ukraine might not even exist today. He is probably right. What he did not say, what none of the men who came back this week said, because they are not the kind of men who say such things, is whether the price was worth it. 40 years of headaches, 40 years of watching comrades die from heart attacks and cancers in their 20s and 30s and 40s, 40 years of an invisible enemy that no one could see or measure or be believed about. The disaster happened 40 years ago today. The cleanup is not scheduled to be complete until 2029 at the earliest, if the arch is repaired on time, if the funds are committed, if the war allows the work to proceed. The morning of April 26, 1986 is still not finished.